the men of Israel and Yehudah rise up with a great cry of victory and pursue the Philistines until the approach to the Gay and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine corpses are strewn along the road to Sha'araim up to Gat and Ekron. Meanwhile, Shaul asks his general Avner to find out who this is, whose son David is, and Avner brings him to Shaul in David's own words, quote, "The servant of the king, Yishai." Episode 4. The Rise of David. Shepherd, singer, warrior. In the last episode of the Kings of Israel, we witnessed the ultimate fall of King Shaul. Not his physical fall, for he still reigns on the throne of Israel, but for his failure to fulfill the letter of the commandment of the Almighty. The divine spirit leaves Shaul, and the prophet Shmuel has notified him that he and his progeny are to be bereft of the kingship as a result of his transgression. Instead, that kingship will pass and will be conferred upon another, more worthy of kingship over the children of Israel. The Almighty speaks to the prophet Shmuel, who is still mourning over the failure of King Shaul, which the prophet Shmuel takes personally to his heart. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, Ad masai ata misabel al Shaul, va'ani ma'astiv mimelech al Yisrael. Male karnecha shemen, velech eshlachecha el Yishai, beis halachmi, ki raisi bevanav, li melech. And the Almighty said to Shmuel, "How long will you grieve over Shaul, when I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with olive oil for anointing a new king, and go. I am sending you to Yishai, in English, Jesse, the Bethlehemite from Bethlehem, Beis Lechem, for I have determined that one of his sons shall be king." Yet in the meanwhile, there reigns a king over Israel already. The Almighty has not removed Shaul from the throne, and Shmuel is afraid that Shaul will have Shmuel executed as a rebel against the king. Seeking to replace a sitting king is, after all, a capital offense under the laws of Israel. But the reason Shmuel is afraid is unclear. He has received a commandment from the Almighty. Shmuel knows that this world is fleeting. Thus, the reason he gives the Almighty for his fear, quote, "lest Shaul kill me," is reminiscent of the fear of his forefather Yaakov, when he prepared to face his estranged brother Esav. In the words of the sages, Yaakov, Jacob, was afraid, quote, "lest transgression might have caused him to lose favor in the Almighty's eyes." So too here, Shmuel worries that he may have lost favor in the Almighty's sight. Moreover, as the early commentators have suggested, the very fact of the fear itself is a sign to Shmuel that the divine spirit may not be resting as strongly upon him. The feeling of fear itself is cause itself for Shmuel to worry about whether the divine presence is with him as it was before. So Shmuel comes up with a plan. He will travel to Beis Lechem to ostensibly bring oilos, elevation offerings, to the Almighty. But privately, Shmuel will anoint David secretly as king over Israel, a fact that will remain a secret until the time is right and the divine plan for that anointing to be revealed. Shmuel arrives in Beis Lechem, and the elders of the city rush out to greet him in trepidation. They are alarmed, for one never knows why a prophet of the divine force has arrived to speak. But Shmuel reassures them, as he shows them the heifer he has brought for the elevation offering. that he has come in peace and intends to bring an offering to the Almighty. He calls on them to call together the inhabitants of the town and its surroundings to a feast in honor of the offering. And there he sees one of Yishai's sons, Eliav. But the Almighty does not command him to anoint Eliav. Shmuel thinks this is because Eliav is not tall of stature like Shaul, nor is he as strikingly handsome as the Benjaminites. For surely these are the features, thinks Shmuel, of an anointed king over Israel. These, after all, were the physical attributes that made Shaul outstanding outwardly. But the Almighty corrects Shmuel. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, al tabet el mareu, ve'el gova komaso, ki mastihu, ki lo asher yire ha'adam, ki ha'adam yire la'einayim, v'Hashem yire la'levav. But the Almighty said to Shmuel, pay no attention to his outward appearance or his stature, for I have rejected him. For not as a human sees does the Almighty see. Mortal man sees only what is visible, but the Almighty sees into the heart. The first king of Israel, Shaul, was picked due to popular demand by the children of Israel. Obviously with the Almighty's ultimate consent, although with the reservation that the way the children of Israel had asked at the time was incorrect. But this new king, the Almighty tells the prophet, will be the Almighty's choice, and the Almighty sees the inward qualities of the person. What looks outwardly beautiful and is popular may be less beautiful inwardly, and this is the case here as well. One by one, Yishai's sons pass before Shmuel. Next after Eliav comes Avinadav. But he is not the one the Almighty has chosen as the anointed king of Israel either. Nor is his brother Shammah, who also passes before Shmuel without any divine sign that he is the chosen one. Altogether, 7 of Yishai's sons pass before the prophet Shmuel, and each one is passed over by the Almighty. And so Shmuel, knowing that the Almighty is not a being that errs, that makes mistakes, inquires of Yishai if he has any more sons. To this Yishai assents. Yes, there is another son, the youngest one, but that one, says Yishai, is herding sheep. Shmuel tells him, send someone to fetch him, for we will not sit down to the feast today until he arrives. And now we receive our first glimpse of a figure whose importance to history cannot be overestimated. David. The first thing we hear about David is, Vayishlach vayavieu v'hu admoini im yafe einayim v'tov roi. Vayomer Hashem, kum mashacheu ki zehu. So they sent and brought him. He was ruddy-cheeked in complexion, bright-eyed, and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. And the Almighty said, arise and anoint him, for this is the one. His complexion was red, and this, say the sages, pointed to a nature that was able to shed blood. But in David's case, he would use this ability to shed blood only on the command of the Almighty. And thus, this propensity for bloodshed of this king of Israel would be channeled only in a divinely sanctioned manner. David was by no means tall, as Shaul was, and the description of his eyes was in fact a hint to the probing of the internal self, the inward heart, and understanding that only the Almighty, that omnipotent and omnipresent force that sees the inward desires and motivations of a person, can gain that inward character of the human being. David was a king chosen by no other force than the creator of the world himself. Shmuel takes the horn of oil and anoints David in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Almighty rests on David from that day on. Shmuel then sets out and returns to Ramah. Other than his father and his brothers and the prophet Shmuel, no one else knows about David at that time, and certainly not Shaul. The Almighty has thus created a hidden tension in the midst of the kingdom, where there reigns a known king, Shaul, who is effectively no longer the true king, and the hidden king, the anointed of the Almighty himself, David. This state of reality creates great upheaval within Shaul and around him, without Shaul being fully aware of the cause. And the Spirit of the Almighty had departed from Shaul, and an evil spirit from the Almighty began to terrify him. Shaul's servants say to him, "An evil spirit of the Almighty is terrifying you." This was a sign that the divine presence had left Shaul. And it was the lifting of that divine presence that causes him to feel deeply ill at ease and become subject to dark speculations. For in truth, no evil spirit emanates from the divine force that controls the world, who is only a source of good. Rather, it is the lifting of the resting of that divine force upon Shaul that allows this deep feeling of being ill at ease and darkness to engulf Shaul's mind. The servants of the king suggested as follows: "Let our Lord give the order, and the servants in attendance upon you will seek one who is skilled at playing the lyre, the harp. Whenever the Spirit of the Almighty comes over you, that person will play upon it, and it shall be well with you." So Shaul answers his courtiers, "Seek out someone who plays well and bring him to me." Vayan echad mi hanarim, vayomer hine reisi ben Yishai, beis chalachmi, yodea nagen v'gibor chai, v'ish milchama v'unavon davar, v'ish toar v'Hashem imo. One of the attendants answered and spoke up, words that will turn out to be fateful indeed. Quote, "I have observed a son of Yishai the Bethlehemite, who is skilled in playing music. He is a stalwart, hardy fellow and a warrior, discerning in speech and handsome in appearance, and the Almighty is with him." This testimony as to the lyre player was unusual indeed, in the sense that adept musicians are not so often of the physical or inward bent of men of war, of soldiers, nor are they known for their wise discernment in their speech. And if they are handsome, the likelihood is that they may be involved in illicit affairs in their personal lives. And so they may not be as kadosh uparush, separated from worldly pursuits in favor of spiritual ones, as David is described here. But this son of Yishai was none other than David himself, the chosen, anointed one of the Almighty, and he possesses all of these attributes altogether. Naturally, this is a person who will grace Shaul's court, and Shaul sends a request phrased as a mere summoning of David, rather than an ongoing appointment into a permanent position, in order to obtain Yishai's consent to send the young man. To this request, Yishai consents, and as was the custom of the children of Israel at that time when visiting an important personage, and in this case no less than the king, Yishai sends with David a gift of wine and a young goat as a present to the king. David, upon whom the divine spirit rests, finds great favor with the king, and the king promotes him to the honored position of being Shaul's arms bearer. And the king sends word to his father Yishai, requesting that he be permitted to keep David in his service. To this Yishai consents. And whenever the evil spirit falls upon the mind of the king, David plays upon his lyre for him, imbued with the divine spirit, and the evil spirit lifts from upon Shaul. and Shaul feels divine joy once again when David plays for him. This was the manner in which the Almighty chose to introduce David to Shaul, and from here on, the story moves to the manner in which David becomes a mighty warrior in Shaul's army, and eventually rises to officially occupy the position of king over all of the children of Israel. David's chance to experience battle would not be long in coming. Because the divine presence has left Shaul, the enemies of Israel gain courage to attack. Once again, this attack comes on the part of the Philistines, the Plishtim. They had lost the children of Israel as their subjects, and they were eager to re-establish their dominance over these upstarts, these Jews, who had gone so far as to place a new king and a new kingdom, no less, over themselves. Insolence, they thought. So they hastened, without even fully mustering their forces, to cross from the land they occupy into the border of Yehudah, and they complete the mustering of their army in Socho, a town in Yehudah itself, the ruins of which can be found in Israel today. There, the Plishtim quickly moved towards the camp of the king. Meanwhile, the Jews, for their part, were not moving toward the Plishtim at all. And this was again because of the fear they felt due to the divine presence having been lessened over their king. Instead, they muster their forces where they are, on a mountain overlooking the Ela Valley, the mountain of Azekah. And there, they face the opposing force on the opposite mountain, with the valley between them, Emek HaElah. Arrayed as the two sides were for battle, the stage was set for one of the epic battles of history. But that battle was to be fought not by armies, but by individuals. Unexpectedly, down into the valley from the camp of the Plishtim steps a huge warrior, a giant of immense stature, towering somewhere between 3 or 4 meters in height, depending on how you translate the ancient measurements into meters, or, if measured in feet, between approximately 10 and 13 feet tall. This warrior, Goliath, or in Hebrew, Golyat, of the town of Gat, was equipped with what are at the time state-of-the-art weaponry and very heavy armor, with a helmet made of copper, a bronze breastplate weighing 5,000 shekels, or in the modern weights, 56 kilograms or 126 pounds, and a spear with a wooden shaft as large as a weaver's beam tipped with iron. Thick, in other words, with the iron tip of which alone weighed approximately 7 kilograms or 15 pounds, and a javelin strapped around his shoulders, with his body protected by copper chainmail and his legs covered with copper chaps. He is a tank. He is preceded by a Philistine shield bearer. Goliath challenges the children of Israel to send over a champion to fight him. Vayamod vayikra el mareches Israel, vayomer lahem, lama seitzu la'aroch milchama, halo anoichi aplishti v'atem avadim l'Shaul, bru lachem ish, vayered elai. He stops and calls out to the regiments of Israel, and he says to them, "Why should you come out to battle? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Shaul's servants. Pick one of your men and let him come down to me. Im yuchal lilachem iti v'hikani, v'hayinu lachem la'avadim, v'im ani uchal lo, v'hikisiv, v'hisem lanu la'avadim, v'avadatem osanu. If he bests me in combat and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I best him and kill him, you shall be our slaves and serve us." Will become your slaves. But if I best him and kill him, you shall be our slaves and serve us. Vayomer Aplishti, ani charafti es marechos Israel. Hayom hazeh tnu li ish v'nelachama yachad. And the Plishti concluded, "I defy the assembled army of Israel. Choose me a man, and let us fight one another. This gauntlet was not taken up. The divine presence had weakened upon the assembled army of Israel, and no one dared to face the giant Philistine. And so he began to mock the children of Israel who were on the mountain of Azekah above. And this mocking he continued day in and day out, day by day for 40 days. Meanwhile, back in Beis Lechem, Ishai begins to worry about his 3 sons, Eliav, Aminadav, and Shammah, who as his oldest sons were the ones required to serve in Shaul's army, while David, as his youngest son, was charged with taking care of his father's flocks. Ishai calls David, telling him, "Please take to your brothers this ephah." An ephah is a day's worth of grain, of toasted grain, and 10 loaves of this bread, and hurry to the camp to your brothers, and bring these 10 cheeses to the captain of the 1,000. Also, find out how your brothers are doing, and bring tidings of them to me. David rises early and leaves the sheep with someone to guard them, and leaves to the battlefront. Shaul and the army of Israel are arrayed for battle in the area of the Elah Valley, the Emek HaElah. David passes a company of troops making their way to the front, shouting battle cries. As he arrives, Golyat appears again in the valley and begins to hurl insults at Israel as usual. The Jews flee in fear from the giant, and the men tell David, "You see that man who has emerged? He comes to insult Israel. Whoever succeeds in killing him, the king will confer upon him great wealth, and he will give him the princess his daughter in marriage. And that man's family will be free of all obligations to the king." Vayomer David el ha'anashim ha'omdim imo lemor, ma yaseh leish asher yakeh es ha'plishti halaz vehesir cherpa mi'al Yisrael ki mi ha'plishti ha'arel hazeh ki cheref me'marechot Elokim chaim. David replies incredulously, "What will be done for the man who slays this Philistine and thus removes the same from Israel? For who is this Arel, this uncircumcised Philistine, that insults the legions of the living God?" Removing that shame is the only honor that a man needs. Striking a blow for the honor of the Almighty and his firstborn people, Israel, is enough honor for anyone without any other prize. ויאמר לו העם, כדבר הזה לאמור, כה יעשה לאיש אשר יכנו. The people answer him with these words, saying, "This is what will be done for the man by the king who kills this giant." וישמע אליאב, אחיו הגדול, בדברו אל האנשים, וייחר אף אליאב בדוד, ויאמר, למה זה? ירדת ועל מי נטשת? מעט הצאן ההנה במדבר. אני ידעתי אס זדונך ואס רוע לבביך, כי למען רעוז המלחמה ירדת. Eliav, David's older brother, hears his youngest brother speaking to the men, and Eliav becomes angry with David and says to him, "Why did you come down from Beis Lechem? And you just abandoned the few sheep you were watching in the wilderness. I know of your schemes and evil heart. You've come here simply to see the war." David turns away from his brother, and he repeats his tirade against the dishonor Golyat is causing to the Jews. David's words are heard and are communicated to the king, to Shaul, and Shaul summons him. Vayomer David el Shaul, al yipol lev adam alav. Avdecha yelech v'nilcham im haplishti hazeh. David says to Shaul, "Let the heart of no man fall because of this man. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Shaul sizes up the youth standing before him, and he says to David, "You cannot go to fight this Philistine, for you are but a boy, while he has been a warrior from his youth." David says to Shaul, "While your servant was a shepherd, tending his father's sheep, the lion came, or the bear, and they carried off a sheep from the flock I was shepherding. I went after the lion, struck it down, and saved the sheep from its mouth. Then it attacked me, but I grabbed onto its beard and smote and killed it. The lion and also the bear your servant managed to kill, and this uncircumcised Plishti shall become like one of them, for he has insulted the armies of the living God. Then David said, the Almighty who saved me from the claws of the lion and from the claws of the bear, he will rescue me from the hands of this Plishti. Shaul said to David, go, and may the Almighty be with you. Shaul dresses David in his own battle uniform and puts a copper helmet on his head and places him in his own armor. David girds Shaul's sword over his battle garments, but he does not want to go out in heavy armor, nor carrying a heavy sword, for he is not accustomed to these. So David says to Shaul, I am unable to walk with these, for I am not accustomed to them. And David takes them off. David takes his staff, his shepherd's staff in his hand, and picks out 5 smooth stones from the riverbed, and puts them in his shepherd's bag, in his pouch, and his sling is in his hand. David then approaches the Philistine. The Plishti approaches as well, going closer and closer to David, and the Plishti's shield bearer was in front of him. The Plishti looks and he sees David and he scorns him, for he sees that he is a youth with a reddish complexion and handsome and boyish. The Plishti calls to David, am I a dog that you come after me with sticks? And the Plishti curses David by his God. The Plishti says to David, come to me, and I will feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and to the beasts of the field. Golyat is telling David in so many words and in colorful language that the normal honorific burial of a warrior who has fallen in battle is too good for David. For David is not a warrior at all, but merely an unseasoned youth, unworthy of military honors. And now comes one of the greatest lines of bravery, uttered before an apparently incomparably mighty foe that the world has ever known. It is an utterance, a statement of faith and strength through faith, in the covenantal relationship between the Almighty and the people of Israel that echoes down the thousands of years of the eternal Jewish people to the very present day itself. David says to the Plishti, you come to me with sword, with the spear and the javelin, but I come to you with the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, against whom you have blasphemed. On this day, the Almighty will deliver you into my hand, and I will slay you, and I will remove your head. I will offer the carcasses of the Plishti camp this day to the birds of the heavens and to the beasts of the earth. Then the whole world will know that Israel has God. וידעו כל הקהל הזה, כי לא בחרב ובחניס יושיע השם, כי לשם המלחמה, ונשן אסכם בידינו. And this the congregation of Israel will know, that not with a sword or a spear does the Almighty save. For war is the Almighty's, and he has placed you, the Plishtim, into our hands. As the Plishti walks and approaches David, David moves fast and runs towards the battle line, towards the Plishti. David reaches into the pouch, takes a stone from there and slings it, and strikes the Plishti in the forehead. The stone penetrates his forehead, embedding in his brain, and Golyat falls face down upon the ground. Thus David overpowers the Plishti with sling and stone. He smites the Plishti and kills him, and there was no sword in David's hand. David runs and stands over the Plishti. He takes Golyat's great sword, draws it out of its great sheath or scabbard, and finishes him off, and cuts off his head with it. The Plishtim see that their hero is dead, and they too flee. The men of Israel and Yehudah rise up with a great cry of victory and pursue the Philistines until the approach to the Gay and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine corpses are strewn along the road to Sha'araim up to Gat and Ekron. Meanwhile, Shaul asks his general Avner to find out who this is, whose son David is, and Avner brings him to Shaul. The answer is, of course, that David is the son of, in David's own words, quote, the servant of the king, Yishai. As usual, here on the Kings of Israel podcast, we'll end this episode with a deeper understanding, what's called the Dvash Tachas Halashon, or the honey under the tongue of the history related here. 2 points. First, the lack of recognition of Shaul and his general Avner of the identity of David. After all, they have just met David, and Shaul has given him his sword and armor. This lack of recognition, says Rabbi David Vali, one of the students of the Ramchal, is from the great divine light that was revealed in David at the time of his victory against Golyat, rendering him changed in appearance. David was shining with divine light. The second point is one about the stone taken from David's pouch that was used to smite the giant. It turns out that the 5 stones David took from the river are actually of spiritually far deeper significance than one might think from reading the verses themselves. These stones represent the 5 sources of divine strength, or Gvura, taken from one of the rivers from which divine power emanates from heaven. And through the uttering of the holiest name of the Almighty, these 5 stones fuse together into a single stone that David used to smite Goliath, who himself represents the sum total at that moment of the opposition at that time to the Almighty in this world. Thus, the smiting of Goliath by David has a much deeper spiritual significance, as in the case of all Israel's wars. On the next episode of the Kings of Israel, David's star continues to rise. He becomes a fixture at King Shaul's court. Yet the seeds of an epic rivalry have been sown, and those seeds begin to take root and sprout, leading to one of the most dramatic relationships in human history.